Well, one of the most important tests that a young infantry officer has to pass at the U.S. Army Infantry School in Fort Benning, Georgia, or Fort Moore, or whatever we're calling it today, is the night land navigation course. Now, grizzled old sergeants will tell you that there is nothing more dangerous in the world than a second lieutenant with a compass and a map. But of course, it has to be done. And the night land navigation separates the good from the bad. If you can't get yourself from point A to point B in the middle of the night, you're certainly not going to be able to get a platoon of 30 men to do the same thing. And they will not be happy about it, trust me. The night course involves using a compass and a map to navigate from the starting point through the woods onto a series of fire breaks where there are numbered stakes at 100-meter intervals. And so the idea is you navigate through the woods across the terrain, and you come out at a particular stake, and then you shoot another azimuth, and you go to another stake, and that's how you go through the course. It takes about 3 hours or so to do this particular course. And it's a challenging piece, but if you do it right, it kind of moves in sequence from one to the other. Now, the night that we did the course, it was cloudy. There was no moon, so it was pitch dark. I mean, you could not see 5 feet in front of you. And there was also lightning in the area. So every time the lightning would strike in the distance, my compass would twitch a little bit. Very reassuring as we started out. Well, okay, I set off on the first azimuth, moving through the woods toward this stake, and things were going well. Then it started to rain. Okay, that's not a problem. If you're in the infantry, it's going to rain. We always said there's no such thing as bad weather, just the wrong clothing. So I wiped the drops off my compass and just kept following the azimuth. But about 800 meters into the course, I'm walking along, and suddenly I felt the ground disappear. You ever watch Wile E. Coyote in the Roadrunner cartoons? When he goes off the cliff, right? And he's kind of that moment where he's hanging in the air before he plummets downward. That's what it felt like. Suddenly I found myself plummeting into a sinkhole 10 feet deep. Now, fortunately, there was a thick layer, 3 feet of mud and muck at the bottom of this pit to break my fall. But my glasses, my compass, my map, my equipment went all cattywampus. Had to try to find all that and then try to find my way out of the pit. By that point, I had lost the azimuth, and I came out of the pit crawling up through the mud on the wrong side and shot the azimuth wrong, to the point at which a few minutes later I came out onto the fire break, dead between two of these stakes. 150 meters to the left, 150 meters to the right. So I had to choose one of them, and I chose poorly. And once I chose that stake poorly, in order to shoot the right azimuth to the next one, you have to shoot from the right one, and so the whole course went sideways, and I flunked the test. Panic in the pit led to chaos on the course. And I think about that sinkhole, that pit, when I read the Joseph story. It always comes to mind. The story of a young man on a confident journey to what he believes is the destiny he set out for, suddenly finding himself in a pit with his direction in life now uncertain. Wasn't what he planned. The azimuth of his life, though, was now out of his control. He's facing his own difficult test there in the dark. The test that many of us face when we have far more dire circumstances than a night land navigation course. The question that Genesis 39 raises for me, like that dark night in the Georgia woods, is how do we get out of the pit? How do we move forward when the unexpected, the unfair, the unplanned leaves us mired in the dark? How do we choose the way forward wisely? Well, when we left Joseph He had just been sold into slavery by his brothers, the result of their jealousy of him and his royal dreams. Remember, those dreams were about them bowing down to him, and they want to get rid of him. So now they've sold him into slavery, and Joseph, those dreams now in the past, is trudging off to Egypt as a captive of these Ishmaelites who are going to sell him down in Egypt. Joseph has moved from being the favored son now to being a lowly slave. Now, slavery was a common practice in the ancient Near East. Almost anyone could become a slave by being captured in a war or taken in a raid from rival tribes or nations. Impoverished families might sell their children into slavery in order to pay off debts. So slavery then was not so much about race or ethnicity as it was about circumstances. And Joseph's circumstances here are pretty dire. He's a commodity to be bought and sold. He's stripped of his royal robes and his freedom. He's now in a country where he doesn't know the language. He doesn't know the customs. He's subject to the whims of whoever purchases him. It would seem that Joseph is completely powerless in this situation. And yet, he's not. And that's because Joseph isn't operating under his own power. We learn in verse 2 that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered. You may notice that this is a recurring theme in Genesis. God promises to be with people at critical points in the story, with Noah, with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Joseph may have heard the promise of God recounted to him by his father Jacob, may have heard of Jacob's dream of that stairway to heaven, and God standing beside him saying, I will be with you no matter what. And even though we don't see Joseph having another dream here or God telling him of his presence, Joseph believes God is with him, and he acts on that. He chooses to believe that the pit, the downward fall of slavery and powerlessness, he refuses to believe that's the end of the story. Joseph believes that God has his ultimate destination in mind. We talked about this some last week, saying that our dreams are best realized when they are aligned with God's dream for the good of his people and his creation. But now we get into the application. How do we live that dream? Well, not surprisingly, church, it begins with faith. And not just faith as intellectual belief, but rather faithfulness or acting on that belief. Joseph chooses to believe that God is with him, and therefore he has power to work regardless of the circumstance. Now, Joseph is a slave. That's the lowest you can get in that world. But the text implies that Joseph doesn't see being a slave as being beneath him. If Joseph is going to be a slave, he seems to reason, he determines he's going to be the best slave that he can. He trusts that God is going to honor the effort, and that by being the best he can be in a seemingly hopeless circumstance, something good will come out of it. Good will come out of it because of God. Joseph teaches us that faithfulness isn't dependent on our circumstances, but rather on our attitude. When we find ourselves in a dark place, when we find ourselves in a stuck place, we can choose to stay stuck, or we can do the best we can with God's help. We might have fallen into an illness, a financial situation, a job loss, any other of a host of things that we didn't plan. But we always have a choice. We can panic, or we can pray. We can be faithful, or we can fail. We can choose to be the best in that situation. To put it another way, your attitude determines your altitude. I think of someone when I think about this story as well. I think of a woman named Cheryl who was in my last church. Cheryl had dealt with cancer 3 times over the course of 20 years. It kept coming back. During my 13 years in Monument, Colorado, I spent a lot of time with Cheryl both in and out of the hospital. And she went through these cancer treatments, and you know they can be really devastating. But you never would have known that it was affecting her at all. Rather than wallow in her diagnosis and give up In the midst of that horrific treatment, Cheryl decided she was going to be the best patient in the hospital, the best Christian witness that she could be. So when doctors and nurses would come into her room, she would be smiling. And she would say, "How are you today? What can I pray for you today?" They would say, "Well, you know, things are pretty serious here." She said, "Yeah, I know. God's not through with me yet." That was her attitude. She prayed for them. She prayed with them every day. She always smiled. She had a kind word for anybody who walked in the room. God's not through with me yet. She said, and even when the day comes that this fight is over, I still know that God wins. One of the great sadnesses I had in leaving that church was that I did not get to do her funeral. She passed away shortly after we moved here to York. She was one of the most positive and faithful people I've ever known in my life. Someone who had no reason to be content. And yet she was, because she believed God was with her. And she was going to use that circumstance for his glory. She affected hundreds of lives because of that faithfulness. I'll never forget it. Joseph chose the same. He chose wisely. And his attitude of faithfulness was contagious. Now you notice Potiphar, his master, who's an Egyptian pagan, mind you, even saw that the Lord was with him. Notice that there are 3 different references to the Lord in the first 2 verses there, verses 3 and 4, there in Genesis 39. But God isn't intervening miraculously here. And yet Joseph knows that God is present, and that's enough. As a result, Joseph's circumstances change. His attitude leads to his elevation as the chief steward in Potiphar's house. Verse 5 says, "The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field." Even if we find ourselves in the pit, an attitude of faithfulness can elevate us out of it and elevate everyone around us. Again, attitude determines altitude. Now, this is not the only time Joseph's going to have to find his way out of a pit. Joseph's now at the top of his game. There in Potiphar's house, he's got lots of responsibility and trust. Apparently, he's also growing into quite the handsome young man. He's now the chief steward in the house. Now he's a strapping young lad. Remember, when he gets sold into slavery, he's about 17. He's probably about 20, 21 at this point, but he's still a slave. And slaves in the ancient world, whether they were male or female, were often used for the sexual pleasure of their owners. No one in the world of ancient Egypt would have seen this situation as unusual. But Joseph is no unusual person. No usual person. His faithfulness is tested again when he's presented with the temptation of sleeping with his master's wife. Another sinkhole that develops right in front of him. "Come to bed with me," she purrs. But Joseph doesn't give in. He's going to choose wisely. He won't sacrifice his integrity or his faithfulness to be her boy toy. Listen again to his response. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern myself with anything in the house. Everything he owns has been entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" And though she spoke to Joseph day after day, he refused to go to bed with her or even be with her. See, Joseph has been measuring his steps, keeping an eye out for the sinkhole of sin that was forming right in front of him. He recognizes the temptation because he's deliberate and focused. Here again, we see the contrast between Joseph at the end of Genesis and Adam and Eve at the beginning, refusing momentary pleasure in order to receive a greater prize. We remember the impulsiveness of Esau, selling his birthright for a bowl of soup. We especially see that contrast played out between Joseph and his brother Judah. If you've been reading along with us, you know that the Joseph story begins at Genesis 37 with him, having his dreams, then being sold into slavery, and then it skips over to 39, where now he's in Egypt. But in between, there's this really sordid, salacious tale of Judah and Tamar. It's a sex scandal kind of story, and people say, "Is this in the Bible?" Yeah, it is. In fact, I did a whole midweek Bible break on it. If you really want to get into it, you can go watch that this week and be shocked and scandalized by all of it. But the point is, now we've got this weirdness going on in chapter 38 with Judah, one of Joseph's brothers, who gives in to all of his impulses. He rolls all with it. And then you have Joseph who says, no, integrity is more important. Joseph honors God. He recognizes that if he sleeps with Mrs. Potiphar, it won't just be a sin against the trust of his master. But notice what he says. It'd be a sin against God. Well, Mrs. Potiphar catches Joseph alone one day, and she essentially commits sexual assault. She grabs at his cloak, but Joseph leaves the cloak in her hand as he runs away from temptation. Now, don't miss the connection. Joseph, the boy who was given a royal coat, has it stripped from him by his jealous brothers, and now he has another coat stripped from him, this time from a jealous woman. Sometimes we find ourselves in a pit because of circumstances beyond our control. Sometimes the pit is of our own doing. We fail to measure our steps and we give in to temptation. But sometimes the pit is actually the result of us doing the right thing. Faithfulness doesn't always lead to an immediate reward. What's the old saying say? No good deed goes unpunished. Mrs. Potiphar falsely accuses Joseph of attempted rape. Notice what she calls him, this Hebrew slave, dehumanizing him with her words, and shows Potiphar the coat as evidence of the salacious charge. Potiphar, believing his wife, has Joseph thrown into a prison dungeon, another pit. Now, on a side note here, and I'm maybe reading into the text here a little bit, this is an act that should be punishable by death, right? He should kill the slave, but he has him put in prison. I think Potiphar knows his wife a little too well. You know what I'm saying? So he gives Joseph a break here. Whatever happened, Joseph finds himself again in a pit, in the dark, in the dungeon. Verse 21 tells us, though, here again, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. Joseph again refuses to let the darkness of the pit determine his destiny. He begins to rise again. He's given responsibility over all the prisoners. And the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Now, if you've been tracking this, you notice Joseph's life is kind of like a wave at this point. Very high highs and very low lows. And yet the constant in the midst of that fluctuation is faith. It's faith in the fact that God was with him. Whether he was in a position of power or in a pit or a prison, Joseph chose to act out of faith, making the best of every situation. If I'm going to be a slave, I'm going to be the best slave I can be. If I'm going to be a prisoner, I'm going to be the best prisoner I can be. And he used whatever influence he had to give evidence of the work of God with him. Pits are going to form in our lives. We may walk into them unknowingly or accidentally. We may find ourselves stuck in a dark place because of bad decisions we've made. Or we may have paid the price for doing the right thing. Regardless of the circumstance, we can find our way out of the pit because God is the one who elevates us. When we have that in mind, we can be the best we can be regardless of the circumstance because God is with us. Well, back at Fort Benning, I had a chance to retake the test on the night land navigation course. Now, this was an important retest because it was a 2 strikes and you're out thing. And this was a 6-month course of infantry officer basic course. So we were about 6 or 8 weeks into it. I can't remember exactly, but that meant that if I failed it a second time, I would be recycled, that's the term they use, recycled all the way back to the beginning of the course. 6 weeks, 8 weeks, done. So a lot was riding on that night course. Well, they trucked myself and a few other hapless lieutenants back out to the course one night while all the other guys went into town so that we could see if we learned anything. Well, this time, I knew to watch for the holes. I knew those pits were out there. And I measured my steps. I did not get mesmerized by the compass, but I kept looking up and looking ahead to keep from falling in. I trusted the azimuth, and boom, I walked to the correct stake every time. I passed the test. And I'm happy to say that for years later, I never got my platoon lost in the woods at night. Misdirected a couple of times, but never lost. When we take the journey of faith, there will be ups and downs. There are going to be tests, there are going to be pitfalls, temptations and times of being falsely accused. That these things will happen, my friends, is a certainty. How we respond to them, however, is up to us. Will we wallow in the pit, or will we trust God? Will we be beaten down by circumstances, or will we rise to the occasion and be the best we can be with God's help? One of the things that's been helpful to me over the years in keeping an attitude of faithfulness when I'm tempted to wallow in the pit is a prayer by John Wesley. Now, we pray this prayer in our covenant service every year at the beginning of the year, but it's one that I turn to often because it reminds me that while I don't always control what happens, I can control how I respond with God's help. So this is a prayer, a covenant prayer of surrender, but not surrender in the terms of giving up, but rather of giving over my circumstances to God, knowing that He is working for good even when I can't see it right away. So I want to close by inviting you to pray this prayer with me. It's a prayer for those looking for a way out of the pit. I am no longer my own, but yours. Put me to what you will. Rank me with whom you will. Let me be employed for you or laid aside for you. Let me have all things. Let me have nothing. I freely and heartily yield all things to your pleasure and disposal. And now, O glorious and blessed God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, you are mine and I am yours. So be it. And the covenant I have made on earth, let it be ratified in heaven. Amen. That's a prayer from the pit. And a prayer that reminds us, no matter where we find ourselves, God can elevate and make all things new. That's the good news. Thanks be to God.